Hi, everybody. As we're going through the life of Jesus, we're noticing a progression in how he conducts himself with people. In the early chapters of the Gospels, you watch him with a lot of crowds and giving a very, very broad and inviting message, albeit convicting at the same time. But as time goes on, Jesus begins to change his tactics a little bit. Last week, we saw how he begins to speak in parables, which are earthly stories with heavenly points, and they're intended to reveal truth to those who want it, but to conceal truth from those who don't want it anyway. And then we begin to notice that Jesus, as he's interacting with different sets of people, that he can be talking plainly and doing amazing things right in the middle of people watching him do these things, and yet the people don't recognize Jesus at all. The gospel writers pick up on these different scenes, and they portray them to us to not only validate who Jesus really is, but to spur us on to take heed and take care that we're really listening to Jesus and we're really paying attention to him. This week we looked at Matthew's gospel in particular because he has a lot of these scenes, and we noted how Matthew, he lists out three of them in particular. The first scene is where Jesus goes back to his hometown, which is a place where you think people would know him very well and he would be very received. But the opposite happens. They take offense at him. And we saw that really it was the fact that they had preconceived ideas about who Jesus was, and that kept them from recognizing Jesus. Then Matthew moves on in another scene. He talks about Herod, one of the rulers appointed by Roman authority. And Herod is the one who Herod Antipas had John the Baptist beheaded. So he's not exactly a fan of what's going on. But we saw the reason is John the Baptist confronted Herod in his lifestyle. And so really it was Herod's own personal lifestyle of selfishness and self-indulgence that kept him from being able to see and recognize Jesus. And then Matthew rolls out another scene. This time it's religious leaders, and the Pharisees come to Jesus and they challenge Jesus on why he's doing certain things and why he's not doing certain things. And really, as we see this confrontation take place, the answer why they don't recognize Jesus is they have already constructed their religious scheme the way that they want it. So preconceived ideas, personal selfishness, and really self-made religion, those are three things that keep people from being able to recognize who Jesus is, even though he's in the midst of them. Matthew does a masterful job of weaving in amongst these scenes other scenes that literally shout who Jesus is. Jesus feeds 5,000 people with a couple loaves and a couple fish. He walks on water. He goes to multiple places, heals multiple people with multiple different diseases. And you have these two really projections of one group seeing Jesus for who he is and another group not seeing him at all because they don't want to. And then Matthew's three chapters, chapter 14, 15, 16, and 17, 4 chapters, they funnel down to Jesus asking the disciples, who do people say that I am? And the disciples say, well, some people think you're a prophet, some people don't know who you are. And Jesus asks the famous question, he says, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter famously answers for all of them, you're the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. And of course, that's the right answer. And Matthew adds one more little scene at the end of that to really validate the correctness of that answer, and it's the transfiguration. Matthew records that for us in chapter 17. He selects 3 of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, and he lets them go up on a mountainside with them, and there Jesus is transfigured before them, literally, in the original language, metamorphosized before them. And it's the divinity of Jesus just breaking through his humanity. And the disciples come down from the mountainside thinking, we really did answer correctly. He really is the Son of God. In your groups tonight, these stories are varied and they're quite interesting, but they're also very personal. All of us come to Jesus with some preconceived ideas of what he's like, some habits of self-indulgence, and some schemes of how we like to do our spirituality. Listen to what Jesus says in these stories and discuss amongst yourselves, what is Jesus asking us to do when we come to him? What is he asking us to believe, because he came that we might have life and that we might be healed. Have a great time. All right, this week we are pushing forward to really climax of the story, Christmas, the birth of the Savior. And of course, we're going to be looking at the birth narratives in Matthew's Gospel and in Luke's Gospel. Mark doesn't have one and John doesn't have one. So for your preview for next week, you can look in Matthew and you can look in Luke, 2 chapters, the first 2 chapters of both. Really the theme of both of these gospel writers' narratives, they give you a lot of details, they give different details, but the theme is really promises made, promises kept. And as you read these stories tonight, they're very familiar to you, of course, but read them and look for promises that God has made and God has kept. Of course, it's an amazing story of God being faithful to us. And then as you recount some of these familiar promises that you'll be able to read, then maybe enjoy discussing what are promises that God has made that you are particularly thankful for. What are you grateful for this Christmas, that God is a keeper of promises? God never changes. He is always faithful. He never leaves us. So enjoy some rich discussion tonight, and we'll look forward to being in these texts together when we see each other next week.